Imagine telling a modern homesteader that an entire family could survive, not comfortably perhaps, but reliably, on a plot of land smaller than some suburban backyards, with no supermarket deliveries, no refrigeration, no tractor payments, no feed subscriptions, and no emergency grocery runs because somebody forgot eggs. And chances are they would smile politely before explaining why you need 20 acres, expensive infrastructure, and probably a YouTube sponsorship to make livestock viable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For centuries, ordinary peasants with fewer resources than we can barely imagine kept families alive through brutally efficient systems built on tiny spaces. And before we romanticize this, let me be clear. Medieval life was harsh, exhausting, and often cruel. Children died, harvests failed, winters killed, and nobody was posting cheerful, simple living content from their stone cottages. But necessity creates a ruthless kind of intelligence. And what fascinates me is how often desperate people design systems that modern abundance has made us forget. Because the real story here is not medieval peasants were magical. It is that they understood something we increasingly do not. Survival is not about owning more. It is about extracting maximum value from every inch of what you have. Every animal had a job, usually several. Every scrap became input for something else. Waste was not waste because waste was unaffordable, and land was not scenery. It was a machine you tuned carefully or suffered the consequences. Think about how alien that mindset feels today, where many of us treat food as something appearing behind refrigerated glass under fluorescent lights, disconnected from weather, labor, or biological reality. The average person knows the price of eggs but not what it takes to keep the animal producing them, and that disconnect matters because dependency hides fragility. What happens when supply chains crack, prices spike, disease outbreaks hit, or systems we assume permanent suddenly wobble? This isn't a survivalist fantasy, it's a historical reality check. Over this journey we're going to explore 10 animals that helped medieval peasants squeeze astonishing productivity from tiny plots, but more importantly, we're going to examine the mindset behind those choices, because what they built was not primitive chaos. It was integrated systems engineering disguised as poverty. And once you see that clearly, modern assumptions about self-sufficiency start looking a lot less certain than we pretend. Let's start with the animal most modern people think they understand. Chickens, those cheerful little backyard mascots featured in lifestyle blogs and rustic coffee mug art. Except medieval peasants would probably laugh at how sentimental we've become about them. Because to a peasant, a chicken was not a hobby. It was a biological protein engine, a waste processing unit, and a fertilizer factory wrapped in feathers with a questionable attitude. What fascinates me is how different the philosophy was, because modern beginners often ask, "What feed should I buy?" while historical households asked, "How little can this creature cost me while still producing?" And that distinction changes everything. Chickens fit beautifully into tiny systems because they converted otherwise useless scraps into calories. Vegetable peelings, kitchen leftovers, insects, weed seeds, whatever they could scratch into edible meaning. And suddenly household refuse became tomorrow's breakfast. That is systems thinking. But here's the truly clever part. Peasants often valued the egg machine more than the meat, because slaughtering a productive laying hen too early would be economically absurd, like dismantling your paycheck because you're hungry today. The smarter play was sustained yield, long-term extraction, delayed consumption, and honestly that mindset feels strangely sophisticated compared to modern habits built around immediate gratification. Now, let's stay realistic. Medieval chickens produced less consistently than modern selectively bred layers. Veterinary care was minimal, predators were constant threats, and life expectancy for livestock was hardly luxurious. But even accounting for those limitations, the principle remains brilliant. Small animals with modest inputs delivering recurring protein outperform flashy systems with high maintenance costs. And then there's the manure, which sounds deeply unglamorous until you realize fertility was wealth. Healthy soil meant survival, and animals that enhanced crop productivity earned extra value beyond food. Nothing existed in isolation. The chicken fed the family, the scraps fed the chicken fed the garden fed the family again. Closed-loop efficiency like that is not primitive. It is elegant. Perhaps what unsettles me most is how modern abundance encourages linear thinking. Buy feed, buy fertilizer, buy eggs, buy systems, while historical scarcity forced circular logic. And once you begin recognizing that pattern, chickens stop being cute backyard accessories and start looking like tiny feathered industrial strategists that medieval peasants understood far better than we do. If chickens were the reliable salaried workers of the medieval homestead, geese were the violent security contractors nobody wanted to negotiate with. And I say that with affection, because few animals better demonstrate how medieval peasants thought in terms of multifunction survival assets rather than single-purpose livestock. Modern thinking often asks, what does this animal produce? But medieval logic asked something far sharper. How many jobs can this creature perform before it becomes dinner? And geese answered with unsettling enthusiasm. They could survive on marginal land unsuitable for crops, feeding on rough vegetation and wet, useless patches where little else of value grew, which immediately made them economically attractive because competition for prime land was fierce. But what truly fascinates historians, and frankly anyone who has ever been chased by an angry goose, is their defensive temperament, because while chickens panic and scatter, geese often escalate with a level of personal outrage that suggests they believe your existence is itself an offense. That made them surprisingly effective alarms in an age where night security was not abstract. It was life and death. Predators, thieves, wandering strangers, all could mean disaster, and a loud creature that exploded into chaos at suspicious movement became a crude but effective early warning system. Now, are we overstating their tactical sophistication? Perhaps slightly, but anyone who dismisses animal behavior as strategically irrelevant has clearly never dealt with territorial birds. Beyond defense, geese produced feathers for insulation, bedding, clothing enhancement, and tradable goods, turning aggression into economic value, which is honestly a deeply medieval kind of poetry. Then there's rendered fat, an overlooked but enormously important resource in a world where cooking fats, skin protection, waterproofing, and calorie density mattered intensely. What strikes me here is the relentless practicality. Nothing was sentimentalized. Every trait, even bad temperament, became exploitable utility. Modern consumers often separate products into neat categories: security system, cooking oil, bedding, meat. But peasant households compressed those categories into one difficult bird. And perhaps that is the recurring genius here: resource stacking. When one input produces multiple forms of resilience, efficiency compounds. It's not glamorous, it's not cute, but it is brutally intelligent, and the more you study these systems, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as primitive improvisation. Now let's talk about the medieval financial instrument with 4 legs, a filthy nose, and absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. The pig, because if chickens represented recurring income and geese represented stacked utility, pigs represented concentrated wealth conversion, the biological equivalent of turning scraps, forest waste, and patience into winter survival. What fascinates me is how brutally efficient pigs are from an economic perspective, because unlike animals requiring carefully managed pasture, pigs are opportunistic omnivores with the moral flexibility of hedge fund managers. They will convert almost anything remotely edible into body mass, and in a world where calories equaled security, that made them astonishingly valuable. But here's the deeper lesson. Peasants weren't merely raising pigs, they were leveraging ecosystems, because pigs could exploit resources humans couldn't directly use efficiently: fallen nuts, roots, discarded scraps, rough forage, and transform them into preserved protein. That's ecological arbitrage, centuries before anyone used the term. Now yes, access to common forests, local custom, and lordly permissions complicated the picture, because medieval economies were never as romantically free as some people imagine. But even within those constraints, pigs offered extraordinary return relative to input. And then comes the part modern consumers rarely think about: preservation strategy. Meat without refrigeration is a countdown unless you understand curing, salting, smoking, timing, and environmental conditions, meaning the animal itself was only half the equation. The real intelligence lay in the integrated system surrounding it. Slaughter timing aligned with seasonal realities, cold weather reduced spoilage risk, preservation techniques extended food access through lean months, and nearly every part found purpose. Waste was economically irrational. What strikes me emotionally is how close survival sat to competence. One badly managed harvest, one failed preservation effort, one disease outbreak, and consequences became brutally immediate. Compare that to modern households where food failure often means inconvenience rather than catastrophe, at least temporarily. Abundance has insulated us from biological realities in ways both merciful and dangerous, because insulation breeds ignorance. And perhaps pigs symbolize that tension perfectly. We see packaged pork chops under fluorescent lights, while peasants saw stored winter survival hanging from rafters. Same protein, radically different relationship to risk, labor, and reality. But if pigs were medieval wealth in concentrated form, ducks were something arguably even more elegant. Biological pest control that paid you for the privilege of using it. And I love this example, because it completely destroys the modern habit of solving every agricultural problem with isolated interventions instead of integrated systems. When most people think of livestock, they think meat, milk, eggs, maybe wool. But medieval households often thought in ecological functions, and ducks fit beautifully into that worldview because gardens were not decorative side projects, they were survival infrastructure. If slugs, snails, and crop-destroying insects wrecked your yields, the consequences were not disappointing. They were dangerous. Fewer vegetables meant weaker nutrition, fewer preserved stores, harder winters, higher mortality risk. Suddenly, a waddling bird starts looking less ridiculous and more like an employee with specific operational duties. What fascinates me is how ducks offer a rare combination of utility and delicacy, because unlike more destructive foragers, they can move through certain growing areas with less collateral chaos, converting pest pressure into protein while reducing crop losses. That's an extraordinary systems design principle. Use one biological actor to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Now, as always, context matters. Duck breeds vary, management matters. Weather matters, gardens can absolutely be damaged under poor handling. But the conceptual brilliance remains undeniable. And then you add eggs, feathers, seasonal timing, nutritional diversity, and suddenly the animal becomes more than pest control. It becomes resilience layered across categories. What strikes me again is how medieval households understood timing far more intimately than many modern consumers. An egg appearing during a seasonal food gap was not just breakfast, it was strategic relief. A feather was not decorative fluff, it was insulation. Everything had practical weight because material scarcity sharpened perception. Perhaps that is what abundance dulls most effectively, our ability to recognize hidden value. Because when convenience dominates, we stop asking what else a thing can do. Ducks remind us that useful systems rarely exist in neat product categories. Nature doesn't organize solutions the way catalogs do. It stacks functions, overlaps benefits, and rewards observation. And honestly, that may be one of the most sophisticated lessons these supposedly primitive households still have to teach us. Now we arrive at the animal that would make any modern efficiency consultant sit upright and start recalculating spreadsheets. Rabbits. Because if chickens are dependable and pigs are profitable, rabbits are pure biological acceleration. the kind of reproductive efficiency that feels almost absurd until you remember nature is not concerned with human comfort. But what interests me is not the obvious joke about how quickly rabbits multiply. It's what that multiplication meant in a world where protein scarcity was real and land was precious. Because medieval peasants did not have the luxury of dismissing small animals as insignificant. If something could convert low-value scraps into edible mass quickly, it deserved serious attention. Rabbits fit beautifully into constrained systems because they required minimal space, could consume vegetation other animals might ignore, and produced outputs at a pace larger livestock simply could not match. That's not romantic, that's ruthless arithmetic. And here, where I think modern people underestimate historical intelligence, peasants understood throughput, not with spreadsheets but with lived experience. How long until maturity, how much feed disappears, how fast offspring arrive, what survives winter, what can be preserved, what fails under disease pressure. This was practical economics embedded in survival. Now, to be fair, rabbit husbandry carried disease risks, sanitation challenges, breeding management issues, and certainly wasn't the frictionless protein printer internet minimalists might fantasize about. But again, the principle matters. Small-space protein systems radically change survival math when land access is constrained. And rabbits offered more than meat, pelts, manure, warmth, material utility. Because once again, multifunction mattered. What fascinates me emotionally is how these systems reveal a completely different relationship to time. Modern consumers expect immediate convenience, while historical households often managed living production cycles, balancing patience with urgency, biology with planning. A rabbit wasn't inventory. It was timing, contingency, future calories, material insurance. Perhaps that's what abundance has most effectively erased. Respect for biological process. We have outsourced time-sensitive survival functions to industrial systems so successfully that many people barely understand how food emerges at all. And while that convenience is extraordinary, it also leaves us psychologically detached from the astonishing efficiency that simpler systems can offer when intelligently managed. Rabbits are not glamorous, but neither is survival, and history rarely rewards glamour the way marketing does. If rabbits represent speed, bees represent elegance, because few survival systems in history delivered so much value while demanding so little physical space. And what fascinates me about bees is how they completely challenge our modern assumptions about what counts as livestock. Because technically, you're not feeding, herding, or emotionally negotiating with a creature that might kick you through a fence. You're collaborating with a tiny airborne civilization that operates according to rules older than agriculture itself. And medieval peasants understood this, even if they lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe pollination ecology, colony behavior, or microbial fermentation. They knew what mattered. Put hives in the right place and extraordinary things happen. Honey, obviously, mattered enormously in a world where refined sugar was effectively a luxury fantasy for ordinary people, but reducing bees to sweetener production misses the deeper brilliance entirely. The true magic was compounding utility. Wax created cleaner burning light, which in a world without electricity meant extended productive hours, religious demand, economic opportunity, and practical household value. Pollination increased surrounding productivity, meaning the bees improved the performance of unrelated systems simply by existing nearby. That's astonishing return on footprint. And then there's preservation and fermentation potential, because once you understand stable calorie-dense sweeteners, an entirely new layer of food resilience emerges. Now, let's stay balanced. Beekeeping is not effortless paradise. Swarming, hive collapse, disease, weather, aggressive colonies, theft, poor management, plenty can go wrong. But compared with feeding larger animals through winter, bees offered extraordinary efficiency. What strikes me emotionally is how beautifully this reflects the medieval survival mindset. Leverage natural systems instead of overpowering them. Don't do unnecessary labor if biology can do the work for you. Modern economies often reward control, mechanization, standardization, but resilient systems sometimes reward partnership instead. Perhaps that is why bees feel symbolically important here, because they reveal a survival intelligence built not merely on extraction, but observation and strategic alignment with nature's existing productivity. And frankly, in an era where many people barely notice pollinators until headlines mention ecological collapse, there is something humbling about peasants recognizing practical interdependence centuries before environmental science formalized the concept. Now let's talk about the creatures that may have offered the highest laziness-to-reward ratio in the medieval world: pigeons. And before you recoil because your brain immediately jumps to filthy city birds fighting over sandwich crusts near train stations, pause for a moment, because context changes everything. Modern pigeons are descendants of animals humans intentionally cultivated, and in medieval survival logic, they represented something profoundly attractive. Low input, partially self-managing protein and fertilizer production. What fascinates me is how this reflects an advanced understanding of labor economics, because not every household had spare hours to manage high-maintenance animals. Peasants were already stretched brutally thin between field work, fuel gathering, repairs, preservation, taxes, and sheer survival. An animal that largely fed itself while returning predictable value was not merely useful, it was strategically brilliant. Pigeons could forage widely, exploiting dispersed resources humans couldn't efficiently collect, then return predictably to nesting structures, which effectively outsourced feeding logistics to the animals themselves. That is astonishingly efficient design if you think about it. And then comes the uncomfortable but historically important reality of manure value, because modern people dramatically underestimate how central fertility was to survival economics. Productive soil was wealth, and nitrogen-rich fertilizer could materially alter yields. When crop productivity decides whether winter becomes hunger, droppings stop being disgusting and start looking like strategic assets. What really captures my imagination, though, is famine resilience. Systems that rely less directly on household feed reserves can behave differently under stress, and in unstable times, redundancy matters. Now, let's not oversell pigeons into miracle creatures. They caused crop conflicts, disease concerns existed, predator pressures remained, and access sometimes reflected class privilege depending on region and legal structures. Medieval life rarely offered frictionless efficiency, but the principle still matters. The most resilient systems often reduce labor intensity while maintaining output diversity. Modern culture glorifies complexity, dashboards, optimization apps, and endless management layers. Yet here was a remarkably effective biological arrangement requiring surprisingly little intervention. Perhaps that's why this example feels so psychologically jarring. We associate sophistication with effort, when in reality good systems often remove unnecessary effort entirely. And if that challenges modern assumptions about productivity, maybe it should, because exhaustion and intelligence are not the same thing, despite what hustle culture keeps trying to sell us. If pigeons were the masters of passive efficiency, goats were the anarchists of productivity, the kind of animal that looks at terrain other livestock reject and says, "Perfect, I'll eat that." And honestly, I think that tells you almost everything about why poor households valued them so deeply. Modern people often imagine efficient agriculture in terms of ideal conditions: flat fields, controlled feed, optimized systems. But medieval survival rarely happened under ideal conditions. Much of life happened on marginal land, rough edges, thorny patches, places too poor, steep, dry, rocky, or inconvenient for larger livestock to justify the expense, and goats turned those neglected zones into biological opportunity. That is extraordinary adaptive efficiency. What fascinates me is how goats embody the principle of land conversion, taking low-value vegetation and transforming it into milk, cheese, meat, hides, and labor-adjacent utility with remarkable resilience. Now, yes, goat owners across history and modern suburbia alike will confirm that goats are also escape artists, vandals, and occasionally furry manifestations of malicious curiosity. So let's not pretend they were effortless saints, but difficult does not mean inefficient. In fact, animals that thrive where others fail often become invaluable under constrained conditions. And then there's dairy, which radically changes survival economics because recurring nutritional output is strategically superior to one-time slaughter when managed well. Fresh milk, preserved cheese, nutritional flexibility. Those matter enormously when food systems are unstable. What strikes me emotionally is how much these households depended on transformation knowledge, because raw outputs alone weren't enough. Milk had to become something storable, hide something usable, manure something productive. Competence multiplied value. Without skill, resources underperform. And perhaps that is another forgotten lesson in modern abundance. We increasingly buy finished products instead of understanding conversion processes, which is efficient until systems fail or prices spike. Goats also symbolize something broader about resilience. Adaptability beats perfection. The ideal resource is not always the highest performing one under perfect conditions, but the one that remains useful under terrible ones. Modern infrastructure often optimizes for normalcy, while survival systems optimize for stress. Those are different philosophies entirely. And if you've ever wondered why historically poor communities around the world repeatedly turn to goats, perhaps the answer is brutally simple. Because goats don't care that life is difficult. And finally, we arrive at the animal that may be the least glamorous but perhaps the most revealing of all. The working beast, because medieval peasants were not merely feeding families. They were moving goods, hauling harvests, grinding grain, transporting fuel, working land, and doing it without engines, fuel stations, replacement parts, or roadside assistance. Which brings us to donkeys, and if modern culture unfairly treats them as symbols of stubbornness, history paints a very different picture. Disciplined endurance specialists engineered by necessity. What fascinates me most is that donkeys expose one of the biggest blind spots in modern thinking about productivity. We obsess over peak performance, when survival often depends more on efficiency, reliability, and endurance. A high-powered machine that fails under stress is less useful than a slower system that simply refuses to die. That's a brutally honest lesson. Donkeys consumed less, tolerated rough forage, survived harsher conditions, and kept working across long time horizons in ways larger prestige animals could not always match. Now, yes, regional variation matters. Horses often dominated where wealth allowed, and no single animal solves every logistical problem, but for constrained households, durable labor capacity was transformative. Because let's zoom out for a moment and recognize what this entire journey has actually shown us. Chickens converted scraps into protein and fertilizer. Geese stacked defense with food utility. Pigs concentrated calories through preservation systems. Ducks turned pest control into edible value. Rabbits weaponized reproductive speed. Bees leveraged ecological intelligence. Pigeons reduced labor intensity. Goats exploited marginal land. And working animals multiplied human effort. This was never about cute farm life. It was systems engineering under pressure. Every creature existed inside a broader loop of inputs, outputs, contingency planning, seasonal timing, and survival economics. And perhaps that is the real lesson modern audiences need, because the deeper story here is not medieval peasants were better than us. But that necessity forced a kind of competence modern abundance often obscures. Convenience is extraordinary, and I am deeply grateful for it. But convenience can also make us forget how dependent we've become on invisible complexity we do not control or understand. Takeaway: resilience does not come from owning more things. It comes from understanding how systems work, how resources connect, and how to create value where others only see limitations. The medieval peasant's greatest technology was not any single animal. It was integrated thinking.